Welcome, everyone. I'm Brendan Baker, Vice President of Development at RAND. Thanks for joining us for this RAND 2020 event. Our RAND Remote Events series is meant to keep you connected to RAND, to our experts and their expertise, while we're staying physically distanced. As we remain apart, it's the start of a new school year here in Los Angeles. And this back to school time looks quite different than what we're all used to. I know a great concern for many of you and for many of my colleagues and friends is how to navigate teaching and learning during a pandemic. As parents and educators try to balance educational needs with equity and safety concerns, what is best for our students? We're very grateful that you've tuned in today to hear from Laura Hamilton, RAND's Distinguished Chair in Learning and Assessment. After her 20-minute presentation, we'll take Q&A for 20 minutes. You can use the question feature on your screen to submit a question at any time during the presentation. Laura Hamilton, a senior behavioral scientist, joins us today from Pittsburgh. Her research addresses topics related to social and emotional learning, educational assessment, accountability, school leadership, the implementation of curriculum and instructional reforms, and education technology. She directs the RAND Center for Social and Emotional Learning Research and co-directs the American Educator Panels, RAND's nationally representative survey panels of teachers and principals. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I'm honored to have the opportunity to share the work we've been doing related to education and COVID-19. As Brandon just mentioned, back to school time this year looks nothing like it has in previous years. The shopping is certainly different. The go-to fashion accessory that's on most kids' shopping lists is color-coordinated masks. But more importantly, teachers, students, families, and state and local education agency leaders are all trying to figure out what the school year will look like and are faced with truly wrenching decisions. These decisions will have ripple effects far beyond those who are directly involved with the education system. They'll determine whether parents who work in other industries are able to return to their jobs full-time. And they could also influence the degree of viral transmission in a community. We here at RAND are gathering data and trying to provide as much guidance as we can to help educators and policymakers make evidence-based decisions that will meet the needs of their communities. The focus of the work I'll present today is on K-12 public schools, though RAND is providing guidance to all types of educational institutions, including early childhood programs and universities. This past spring, schools across the country closed their doors to in-person instruction, and we all began an unprecedented experiment in distance learning. I'll use the phrases distance learning and remote learning interchangeably throughout this presentation to refer to a wide range of approaches that schools used to provide instruction while they were closed. These approaches were all over the map and included low-tech strategies like dropping off packets of paper at students' homes, as well as fairly innovative approaches that use sophisticated technology tools. Most schools had little time to plan for closures and few resources to launch brand new distance learning programs. So the question they're asking now is, how do we move forward to address the limitations of what was provided last spring and to implement more intensive, higher quality instruction this coming year? As the school year gets underway, district and school leaders are developing plans that balance a complex set of considerations, and they face inevitable trade-offs. At a most basic level, the approach that would maximize health and safety for both students and staff, going completely remote and having no in-person instruction, is an approach that's likely to result in lower quality instruction and consequently reduce student learning. It will exacerbate long-standing disparities in opportunities to learn among students from different socioeconomic and racial ethnic groups. And it could be especially harmful for students who rely on intensive instructional supports, including those who receive special education services. These learning outcomes are often downplayed in discussions about reopening. Some advocates of fully remote instruction argue that safety concerns should outweigh other considerations. And of course, safety of both children and adults needs to be prioritized. But we know that students' opportunities to engage in high quality instruction predict a number of life outcomes, including health, financial stability, and involvement with the criminal justice system. We also know that online instruction is typically much less effective than in person. Combined with the inequities I just described, We need to recognize that failure to provide high-quality instruction to all students is likely to have significant long-term effects on children and on society. And so far, I've only really talked about academics, but of course, schools do much more than that. Students form important social relationships with peers and adults, and many students rely on these relationships for guidance and support that they don't get outside of school. Schools also help promote social skills like teamwork and emotional skills like self-regulation. And many distance learning programs aren't well suited to developing these skills. Some students and families rely on schools for physical and mental health care, and a large number depend on them for meal provision. Finally, schools often help connect families and students to other community-based organizations that can meet their needs, like organizations that provide free tutoring or supplemental health services. So school and district leaders clearly have a lot to consider. At the same time, parents and family members are struggling to plan for an uncertain school year. Those of you who have school-aged children who had to learn from home last spring might have become reacquainted with old friends like the quadratic formula or that famous baking soda volcano. That reunion may or may not have been a happy one for you. You probably want to know whether you'll once again be on the hook to be a homeschool teacher. And families need to plan for how they'll balance whatever school-related supports they have to provide with their other responsibilities, including jobs and caring for other family members. Clearly, there are many questions surrounding the challenges of educating our children right now, and RAND is helping education leaders, teachers, policymakers, parents, and employers make informed, evidence-based decisions that will maximize benefits and minimize harms. Our interdisciplinary research teams that include experts in education, employment, public health, and safety are well suited to tackle this incredibly difficult set of questions. And we've been making efforts to collaborate across these content boundaries so that we can develop coordinated, comprehensive guidance. Because of time, I can't describe all of our relevant research today. Instead, I'll focus on a specific RAND resource that's been incredibly valuable for informing responses to COVID-19. Our American Educator panels, or AEP, are nationally representative panels of K-12 public school teachers and principals from whom we can gather data on a variety of topics. We launched the panels in 2014 and they've grown since then. They currently consist of about 25,000 teachers and 5,000 principals who've agreed to participate in online surveys several times a year and receive incentives for doing so. RAND is the only organization that has this type of standing panel of teachers and principals. And the panels have allowed us to help ensure that decisions about policy and practice take into consideration the views and experiences of those who are on the ground in schools. The voices of these groups are often missing from policy debates, and including their perspectives is crucial for informed education policymaking. Because the panel members come from all types of schools across the US, we can look at data separately for schools serving specific student populations, which allows us to understand the disparities in access to resources and supports across schools in different geographical areas or those serving different kinds of students. We can also explore data for specific states, grade levels, or subject areas. So the AEP has been a terrific resource for allowing us to get a comprehensive picture of how schools are responding to COVID-19, and in particular for identifying inequities. In addition to understanding schools' responses to the pandemic, we've used the panels to address a wide range of topics, including several that are quite timely. We've studied school leadership, including how prepared principals feel to meet the needs of diverse students, and we've done a lot of work on social and emotional learning. One project that I'm especially excited about is being conducted as part of RAND's Truth Decay initiative, which many of you have probably heard about. We've been exploring how social studies teachers promote their students' civic learning, including their approach to media literacy, critical thinking, and other topics that go well beyond traditional civics knowledge and can help combat truth decay. These are just a few examples of the ways we've used the panels, and you can see a full set of publications on the website. So now I'll talk about the pandemic. Having these panels in place allowed us to quickly launch teacher and principal surveys to understand how schools responded to COVID-19 in spring 2020. Several other organizations have surveyed teachers, but most haven't surveyed principals, and ours is the only one that uses high-quality methods that allow us to be confident that the findings are nationally representative. I'll share a bit about what we learned, how we're using the findings to develop practical guidance for decision makers, and how we'll build on this data collection effort going forward. I'll focus on a few findings that might be especially relevant to planning for the coming school year. Schools closed quickly and without a lot of advance warning last spring, and teachers had to shift their approaches rapidly in order to continue providing instruction. We were interested in what kinds of training teachers had to prepare for the shift and what learning opportunities they had once schools closed. A majority of teachers, 62%, indicated that they had received at least some training on how to use virtual learning management platforms and technology. However, low percentage of teachers indicated receiving training on other topics we asked about, such as how to engage families or to tailor instruction to individual student needs. Elementary teachers were less likely to report having received training on various distance learning topics than were middle and high school teachers, including topics like how to use virtual learning platforms and how to create distance learning opportunities that are engaging and motivating. Teachers rely heavily on their colleagues for information, advice, and just sometimes to vent. Like the rest of us, when schools closed, teachers found it difficult to be without their colleagues each day. So sometimes on their own and sometimes with support from school or district leaders, many teachers formed professional learning communities, groups of peers who can share ideas and seek solutions, as well as just offer one another moral support. We found slightly more than half of teachers had this opportunity while schools were closed. Together, all of these findings point to a clear need to improve teacher training to give them collaboration opportunities and to ensure that professional development is provided throughout the time that they're teaching and they have access to those networks. So now I'll talk briefly about the ways in which instruction that was delivered remotely differed from and was probably inferior to what students would have received had schools remained open. I want to start by acknowledging that educators across the US responded rapidly and heroically to the need to enact a massive shift in their instructional models. And many of the limitations I'll discuss resulted from lack of resources such as technology or instructional materials. We identified several features of the typical distance learning environment that raised concerns. First, almost 9 in 10 teachers said they did not get through all or most of the curriculum they would have covered had schools remained open. This means much of the content students should have learned last spring went untaught, and there are likely to be substantial gaps in students' prior learning as they start the current school year. Town and rural school teachers were especially likely to indicate that they didn't get through the curriculum. This is part of a pattern of results we saw, with rural and town teachers experiencing greater challenges with technology, including lack of broadband access, not just for students, but for themselves. 1 in 5 teachers said most of their instruction was review of earlier content rather than new content. Emphasis on review was especially prevalent among rural and town teachers, as well as those in schools serving large percentages of low-income students and students of color. Across the board, we saw relatively few teachers who said they emphasized new content in their spring instruction. Finally, nearly 1 in 5 provided no feedback at all on students' work. Another 56% provided feedback but no grades. There's been a vigorous debate in the broader field about whether students should receive grades while schools were closed due to COVID. Some educators and parents worried that it would create too much pressure for kids who are already living through stressful circumstances, whereas others viewed the lack of grades as a way of communicating low expectations, which could exacerbate learning gaps. Regardless, these findings indicate that large numbers of students are starting the school year off having missed out on many of the learning experiences they would ordinarily have had the previous spring. One potential barrier to instruction is the lack of ability to reach all students. Majorities of both teachers and principals reported being able to contact all or nearly all of their students and families while school buildings were closed. But when we break it down by types of school, we see some differences. For example, teachers in secondary schools, high poverty schools, and schools serving majorities of students of color were less able than their peers to reach all or most of their students. The largest gap was between elementary schools, where 71% said they could reach all or nearly all of their students, and those in middle and high schools, where only 48% could. The fact that fewer than half of secondary grade teachers could reach nearly all their students is especially concerning because it can be difficult to make up for lost instructional time in the middle and high school grades, and because adolescence is a time when many youth rely on their teachers and other school staff for adult support. This suggests that school and district emergency plans need to include strategies for obtaining contact information for all students and families. We asked teachers to indicate the supports or resources they needed the most to enable them to provide instruction to keep while schools were closed. By far, teachers were most likely to indicate strategies to keep students engaged and motivated to learn remotely as a major need. This is something we've heard from parents too, and a challenge that those of you with young children might have experienced firsthand. Other areas most commonly noted as major needs by teachers included strategies to address the loss of hands-on learning opportunities, like science experiments or even internships. Guidance or tools for assessing and promoting students' social and emotional well-being, and tools and resources to enable counselors or school psychologists to support students. These findings point to a widespread desire among teachers to help ensure that their students are motivated to learn and are receiving adequate social and emotional supports. So now let's turn to principals. We asked principals what was limiting their school's ability to transition to distance learning. Not surprisingly, students' lack of internet access and concerns about equity were the most commonly noted limiting factors. Principals in high poverty schools were more likely to indicate limitations related to student internet access, devices, communication, and financial constraints. Although most principals didn't view concerns about privacy as limiting distance learning significantly, we're hearing from principals and district leaders that it's becoming a greater concern this coming year as they gain a better understanding of threats to safety online. We're also hearing that even in places that are getting devices out to kids, there are policies that limit what teachers can do online. It can be much more challenging to revise these policies and get all necessary groups to agree on them than to purchase materials or devices. So this process is something school leaders need to engage in now, so they're ready for whatever happens later this year and for future emergencies. Finally, we asked principals whether they anticipated putting more or less emphasis on certain goals after schools reopened relative to those goals' prioritization before schools closed. Planning for future school closures or other emergencies topped the list of goals that principals indicated would be a higher priority when schools reopened. But majorities of principals also said they'd place a higher priority on engaging with families, supporting teachers' professional learning, enacting new social or emotional learning interventions, ensuring students' health and safety, and of course, addressing academic disparities. Just reading through that list is exhausting. And continuing a pattern, higher percentages of principals in high poverty schools anticipated placing a high priority on many of these goals upon returning, compared with their peers in low poverty schools. The key takeaway here is that the role of the principal, one that has always required the ability to balance a large number of sometimes conflicting priorities, will only be more daunting this year. So taken together, what can we say about the new normal for schools? We know school in this coming months and possibly years will not look like it did pre-pandemic. Schools that reopen to in-person learning will need to enact some combination of physical distancing and other safety measures to ensure the health and well-being of both students and staff. They'll also need to be prepared for the possibility of additional building closures, and they'll need guidance on how to make decisions about when to close. Learning loss will be more urgent than ever, especially for students who had been struggling academically pre-pandemic. And school staff will simultaneously be searching for strategies to support students who experience trauma or other threats to mental health as a result of the pandemic. Amidst all the uncertainty and challenges, by drawing on the perspectives of teachers and principals across the US, we've developed guidance to help them start the new year off right. The need for technology infrastructure is obvious, but much of the discussion has focused on student access rather than teacher. And we saw that especially in rural areas, broadband for teachers was a challenge. And though many schools were able to provide the necessary technology to enable distance learning, in some cases policies related to how teachers and students can interact online hindered instructional efforts. Data privacy will be a major consideration this year, and educators need to collaborate with policymakers to develop solutions that facilitate high quality instruction while keeping students and adults safe online. The rapid shutdown of schools highlighted the need for advanced preparation. In a forthcoming report, we'll talk about how schools' pre-pandemic preparedness related to their ability to launch distance learning, and other work points out the need to have these systems in place long before an emergency strikes. Assessment will be crucial this year. States dropped their statewide tests last spring, and teachers will need data to identify students' learning needs this fall, especially given the gaps in learning opportunities I described earlier. Working with several other organizations, we've contributed to guidance on how and what to assess this fall and how to do that remotely. Given the incomplete professional development and access to professional learning communities we observed, school and district leaders should rethink their approach to professional development. It should not only cover strategies for remote learning or social distancing, but should offer ongoing supports and collaboration opportunities throughout the year. Finally, there will be temptation to devote most or all of the professional learning and instruction toward addressing academic learning gaps. But students can't learn academically if they're not okay emotionally and socially. Students will need guidance and resources to address their students' social and emotional learning in ways that contribute to, rather than detracting from, academics. Meanwhile, we here at RAND will continue to do what we can to support educators, including through the American Educator panels. We'll continue to gather the best available national data from teachers and principals on responses to COVID-19 and other key education policy topics. Our next COVID survey is in October. That'll allow us to gauge how the beginning of the school year went. We'll use the panels to provide more detailed data on disparities in learning opportunities and to generate policy guidance on promoting equity. This fall, we're working to launch a new panel, the American School District Panel. This new panel will shed light on how district leaders are addressing some of the challenges we heard about from teachers and principals. We're making our data accessible to anyone who wants to use it through our expanded public data portal. And our new scholarship program will award funds to scholars of color and those from under-resourced institutions to use AEP data. This will increase the diversity and perspectives among those who are analyzing and reporting on the AEP. We're using a range of strategies to ensure our findings and data reach the groups who can use them to inform their decision-making. We're getting the word out about our key findings through short reports, which we call data notes. These are intended to eliminate the need to slog through many pages of text. We know educators and policymakers don't have time to read long reports, so we're sharing key findings as briefly as possible and are distilling the implications of these findings. We're also using commentaries or blogs to highlight implications and recommendations in an even shorter format. On all of our AEP work, we're committed to sharing the original data with others who might want to delve into the details and conduct additional analyses. As I just noted, we've put our COVID data on our portal for anyone to access, and we've gotten a lot of interest in it. Finally, we're collaborating with other researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to coordinate on messaging and guidance. An example is the assessment guidance I mentioned earlier, which pulls together the work of RAND and several other organizations to produce a coordinated set of guidelines. This coordination should help busy educators and policymakers prioritize. So that's all I have for now. Again, I'm honored to have had the opportunity to present these findings and hopefully to increase awareness of how educators across the US are experiencing and responding to the pandemic and how RAND is trying to help. I want to thank the many RAND colleagues who've contributed to this work, as well as the teachers and principals who took time out of their incredibly busy schedules to share their experiences and perspectives. And now I'd love to hear your reactions and questions. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much for those insights. I know there's so much concern and confusion around reopening our schools. As a friend and colleague to so many parents and a son of a mom who spent 38 years teaching elementary education, I want to thank you for your dedication to this important research. Strengthening and safeguarding our communities and the lives of the individuals in them, and rethinking and retooling institutions like our education system are critical priorities of our Tomorrow Demands Today fundraising campaign. I encourage you to learn more at campaign.rand.org. Now let's get to some of your questions. So Laura, we have one here that really talks about social and emotional learning. So could you talk about, are the students' social and emotional needs being met as effectively in a remote environment? Because we could imagine social learning as particularly difficult remotely. Yeah,
that's such an important question. And as you saw from our findings, teachers, and we also found this with principals, really value their strategies to develop kids' social and emotional learning. So they're prioritizing it as best they can. But you're right, Brendan, as you mentioned, it can be difficult to do that remotely. There are a lot of organizations putting out guidelines, including RAND, and one of the things that we and others have said is to really focus on those relationships as a starting point. It's not ideal, you can't go hug your teacher. Brandon, I'm sure your mom got a lot of hugs from her elementary kids over her 38 years. But there are ways to kind of build and maintain and deepen those relationships, even if it has to happen remotely. And just having that feeling of safety and security that there's some adult in your school who you know cares about you, that can go a long way towards supporting kids' social and emotional needs. The other, I think, important factor here is we saw that teachers were both interested in supporting social and emotional learning and promoting engagement. So the loss of those, fun hands-on activities. Those things go together. So having kids who are really engaged and enjoying what they're doing helps to build those social and emotional skills. Coming up with ways to have kids collaborate with one another, for example, even if it's, in a Zoom breakout room, that's a way to kind of keep working on those skills, even though it's a little bit feels a little bit unnatural at first. I think, one thing I should point out is these findings are from the spring, when everybody, as I said, was responding really rapidly. I think we're going to see a lot of innovation this fall because teachers, school leaders, district leaders had time to really think about this. And I do believe that the fact that teachers care so much about their students' social and emotional well-being will help make sure that this happens and that that's a part of the discussion and that's not all just about test scores.
Thank you, Laura, for that. A lot of this conversation around reopening schools and remote learning has been about equity. And Evan asked a great question. Do you foresee the possibility of a remote learning gap emerging going forward between districts that return to in-person learning and those that stay remote?
Absolutely. There are huge concerns about gaps, and there's a number of reasons for that. As I mentioned earlier, we have evidence from other research that online learning is generally not as effective as in-person learning. Now, that could change if we see a big national push to kind of rethink what online learning looks like, and I think we all hope that that's the case. But so that's definitely a concern, that places that had the resources and capacity to return in person, at least for part of the time, might be at an advantage. Another consideration around equity is that with kids at home, there are some families who are able to bring in a lot of resources to support their students' learning. Maybe there's a parent or another family member who's at home full-time to help with homeschooling. They might hire tutors. We know that some families are kind of getting together and forming these pandemic pods where they, have a little homeschool group. There are other families that simply can't do that because the parents are working, they don't have the resources to hire tutors. They might not even have the space in their home or the devices to facilitate the learning of whatever children might be living there. So I think that this is something we will be keeping a really close eye on, is what inequities do we see over the next year, and how can we sort of advise schools and districts on how to address those, particularly when they stem from things that happened outside the school, which is a challenge.
Marta actually asked a question similarly where, focused on, under-resourced areas. So she says, I'm concerned that we're not gathering data on parents in under-resourced, linguistically different communities. Will RAND be gathering more data on parents going forward?
Yes. So I didn't talk about this in my presentation because I was focusing on our teacher and school leader panels, but we have another panel that's called the American Life Panel, which is a sample of households across the country. They sample from all different kinds of communities, and RAND actually provides the laptop and the internet access to people who don't have that themselves. So that enables the panel to be able to be very inclusive and include perspectives from, a wide variety of people in all sorts of different circumstances. So we have started asking a few questions here and there that are geared specifically toward parents. And hope to be able to do more of that. There are also some other household surveys out there that are looking at parents. The other thing I'll mention is I think that, as we go forward with our teacher and school leader panels, one of the topics we hope to engage in a little more deeply is the family engagement part of what they're doing. So understanding what efforts are schools in all different types of geographic areas and so forth doing to reach out and actively engage families in learning, particularly as it continues to be done remotely.
Oh, thank you for that. I look forward to being able to share that with the many donors and partners that are on this call today. So we'll definitely be sending that out as we have more information from your work. Can we talk a little bit about the hybrid models? So we actually have a question here from SB. You focused almost entirely on remote learning without commenting on the hybrid models some school districts are adopting. Do you have any findings regarding the prospects for hybrid models with respect both to learning and to the associated health threats?
Yeah, that's a great question. The reason we focused on remote learning is that our data were collected in the spring. So almost every school across the country just shut down and was not able to pull together the resources to launch any kind of a hybrid model, even if it had been safe to do so, which in most places it wasn't. I will say about the hybrid models is they take a ton of planning. So the districts and schools that are adopting hybrid models this fall, most of them have been engaged for a while in trying to figure out what this will look like. I think I would say we don't know what the effects of those models will be on student learning or other outcomes, including, health and viral transmission. So this is all a bit of a grand experiment. I will say that because we're surveying principals and teachers again this October, and we'll do it one more time this coming spring, we will have data that we'll be able to share on that. I think in the meantime, we talk a lot with district leaders and school leaders, and the thing that they are saying they need the most is clear guidance from county health departments, state departments of health, state departments of education, whatever it might be, so that they can figure out when to close if they need to close, or when it's safe to maybe go back to full-time in-person instruction. So there's a lot of considerations around these hybrid models that we really don't have research on yet, because this is very new.
No, great. Let's turn our attention a little bit to the teachers. And you found, we have a question here. Since teachers found guidance in professional groups, how can participation in these groups be encouraged, especially right now during this remote time that we're all finding ourselves in?
Yeah, teachers really value their colleagues as a source of information. We've done some other work sort of asking, this is pre-COVID, but asking teachers and principals, where do you get information when you're thinking about trying a new method or a new intervention with your kids? And the very first place they go is to their colleagues. So they value those relationships, and they also value them socially, and as I mentioned, as a way to just kind of blow off steam like most of us do with our colleagues sometimes. So I think it's not so much a matter of encouraging the teachers to participate. I think most teachers would welcome that. It's putting the resources and infrastructure in place to enable that. And there's a couple of barriers. One barrier is time. I didn't present this today, but there's other work that we've done that shows that teachers last spring, when schools closed, spent hours and hours every week planning. Because they had to suddenly shift their instruction to a completely different format. They had to maybe write new lesson plans, find new materials. And so I think, teachers were maxed out, a lot of them, and may not have felt like they had the time to participate in those learning communities. But then it's also sort of just creating the basic technology infrastructure that makes, participating in those communities feel as close to a real conversation as it can. More and more districts, I think, as they're kind of learning about these different tools for communication, are building that into their planning. Is not just how can we facilitate teacher-student interaction, but how can we get teachers to have this opportunity. Principals too, told us that they really missed having an opportunity to get together with their principal colleagues in other schools. So I think there's a big need for these kinds of professional networking and learning platforms.
Laura, we were actually chatting about this earlier, but there's a picture or a meme going around that has a kindergartner in front of a computer with a parent that says, you know, my daughter has to learn how to read and to type and to ask questions all in, you know, a minute's time. And we actually have a very popular question here. It says, what type of schedule do you suggest for a kindergarten remote learning, and how to build relationships with kindergartners that when they haven't even been in school yet?
Yeah. This is a really tough one. I think the one benefit that teachers and students had when schools closed this spring is that the teachers had already formed those relationships with their kids. So despite all of the challenges of doing online instruction, teachers knew their kids, they understood their strengths and limitations and what they needed. And we're all starting from scratch now. So, you know, one potential approach that isn't always feasible is to do something called looping, where if I taught kindergarten last year, this coming year I'll teach first grade, and so I'll have those same kids. There's a lot that makes that difficult. Now I, as a kindergarten teacher, have to learn a first grade curriculum, so that might not be very feasible. So assuming that that's not possible, you know, I think that to the extent possible, particularly in the very early weeks, a lot of the interaction that teachers have with children online when they're doing any synchronous, you know, at the same time instruction should be about building those relationships and not jumping immediately into math facts and phonics. Not that those things aren't important, but getting that relationship off on a good start will make the academics go better later in the year. There's also a need to really limit screen time for kids to the extent possible. So any sort of synchronous instruction that says you need to be online from this time to this time, especially for those small kids, should be relatively brief. And then other kinds of activities that might involve, you know, paper, might involve doing something on the computer, but you can do it at your own time. You know, those kinds of things, you want to leave some scheduling flexibility. Also for the family. So if you've got working parents who can't really sit down with their children until early evening, maybe to help walk them through that, you want to give them that flexibility. So I think, you know, limiting the required screen time, limiting the required synchronous screen time in particular, offering as much flexibility as you can, and really focusing on those relationships. One of the things that some teachers did last spring was to just schedule in one-on-one checks with their kids. So maybe just a 10 minute, you know, video call, whatever it might be, just to see how they're doing and to communicate that, like, I'm still here, I still care about you. That's so important. And so to the extent that we can give teachers the space and the freedom to do that and not expect them to just jump right into, you know, administering tests to see how well their kids are doing academically, I think that'll be really important.
You know, Laura, when we first shut down in March, there was a big concern, immediate concern of the technology issues, especially all across our country, but even globally. And we have a question here. To deal with the technology disparity, some have suggested using televised or television classes, as is done in some less developed countries. Has that been pursued as an option?
Yeah, I've heard a small number of districts doing that, and especially I think in rural communities where they were really facing these challenges with lack of broadband. But it has a lot of limitations relative to what you can do with other forms of technology. You know, so it's essentially passive watching. It's, you know, it probably works well if you're you know, if it's a lecture style class, maybe a high school class in particular, where, you know, it's designed so that the students listen to the teacher talk. It could work well for, you know, showing some short bits of content to younger kids. But what's really important in teaching is that active engagement of kids in their own learning. So having strategies that allow kids to work together, allow them to sort of be active during the lesson, to be actively problem solving, sharing their ideas, getting their questions answered. And you can't do that with the television. So I think it's a helpful, you know, districts should do whatever they can to get instruction to their kids. And if that's what they have available, then certainly it's a good option. But I think in ideal circumstances, you'd have more than that.
Great. Well, keeping on this technology thread, can you expand on the privacy concerns that might exist for using technology for teaching?
Yep. So this, as I mentioned, is something that over the course of the summer, as I've been talking with school and district staff, it's kind of a growing concern. Some of it is the typical, what they call Zoom bombing, where you're in a meeting and somebody comes in who wasn't invited, who shares content that you don't want shared with your 6-year-olds. That kind of thing, most districts have figured out how to prevent, and they've developed passwords and things like that. The bigger concern has to do with students and teachers interacting via video, and the possibility of recording those interactions. So for example, you might have a teacher who's teaching a class on a remote platform. Kids are joining by video. They're maybe recording that class because there's another set of kids who aren't able to join synchronously, and they're going to watch that video later in the evening. And there's a whole bunch of risks that come from that. I think the main one is that in a classroom with children and teachers, any information, any responses the kids give, anything they say is it's private. It's only happening in that classroom. Once you put that on video, anybody could see that. And so there's real concern that doing so could actually violate some of the federal and state privacy laws. There's also concerns about what happens if a teacher sees something on video happening in a student's home, and then needs to report on it. So there's just a lot to think about when you start to really sit down and think about the fact that teachers have windows into kids' homes, and the wider world might have a window into that whole set of interactions. And so there are ways around it. Some districts are thinking about strategies to, either not videotaping or making the videos, password protected and destroying them to try to keep them from becoming, public beyond the kids who are just in the class. Teachers are even worried about parents sort of snooping over their kid's shoulder and maybe not liking the teacher's instructional method. So it's a whole new world. And I think there's a lot to really think about as you're figuring out what it makes sense to implement.
Question from Keisha. Yes, based on the observations and data gleaned from this pandemic and its unprecedented effect on the education system and individual learning, does RAND have plans to launch research to find solutions that inform and set policy so that this type of situation is not repeated?
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't even talk at all about the vast amount of research RAND is doing on pandemics beyond the education context, and we're doing a lot, and I'm not the most qualified person to talk about that because I've had my head in education for a long time, but we're certainly our healthcare, our public health researchers are doing a lot of work in that area. I think from the education perspective, we are trying to glean guidance from our data that we can share with education policymakers and with educators that will help them be better prepared the next time. We have prior work. We've done work with the Centers for Disease Control a while back. We've done other work on sort of technology-based instruction, and so we're kind of drawing both on the earlier work RAND has done and the data we're collecting during this pandemic to really provide some guidelines around how do you plan for this happening again, because this exact thing probably won't happen again, but as we've seen, being prepared for an emergency and being prepared to launch different types of instructional models is really valuable.
Laura, thank you again, and thank you all for joining us and for participating. Our next RAND 2020 event will be on September 17th with Shanti Nataraj, a senior economist and director of RAND's Labor and Workforce Development Program. So stay tuned for more information and for your invitation. Until then, feel free to reach out to us at randremote@rand.org. Stay well.